So I am Kathy Hawk. I'm an Associate Education Director with the ABA Division for Public Education, and we are thrilled once again to be partnering with the Sacramento Federal Judicial Library and Learning Center Foundation on their Summer Teachers Institute. This year, pivoting once again to a virtual speakers series. For this session, we are thrilled to be joined by Natasha Scott, who is the Director of Educator Engagement with iCivics. Natasha, prior to joining iCivics, was a teacher with the Boston Public Schools for 14 years. And for today's session, we've asked Natasha just to think about how to apply student free speech issues, specifically Tinker v. Des Moines, in the classroom and through the lens of the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. I'm very excited to have her here to talk about the EAD Roadmap. It's something the American Bar Association is a supporter in and a partner in rolling out. And I'm hoping that today you are able to take away some practical approaches for your classroom, either today, next week, or in the next couple of weeks as you head back to the classroom. So with that, Natasha, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Lovely to have you all here with us today. Really, since we're a small group, it makes it great to have the opportunity to pose questions, share ideas. And throughout today's discussion, you'll really see that I'm not going to sit here and talk at you for an hour. So it's perfectly fine to keep your cameras off. Do not worry about that. I know some of you are enjoying lunch. Some of you are just, thinking about the conversation. And so to help us with our conversation today, I do have a landing site, and I will put that into the chat for everyone to go ahead and open up. And what this landing site is going to do is just kind of help facilitate our conversation. In this virtual space, we know sometimes it's hard to unmute ourselves. Luckily, we're a small group, so if you want to unmute, go right ahead. But sometimes it's hard and challenging to unmute yourself. And so we want to make sure that we're creating the space that you can engage and share your thoughts and ideas. On here, you will find our slide deck for today. Sometimes it's nice to go back and have your own mini version. We all know what that's like. And it's always good to start with just welcoming introductions. So what I would love for you to do is go ahead and add yourself to the map. So this is Padlet, which is wonderful. If you press the plus in the top right-hand corner, it will add your location to the map. And then just tell us a little bit about yourself. Your name, your school, if you work for a district level, just where your district is located, and how have you explored the topic of student-free speech rights previously, or how have you thought about it? So take a minute, go ahead and share your thoughts and introduce yourself there. I will say one of the great aspects of using a map to track kind of how we're engaging with people, it's kind of reassuring as we dive deeper into this conversation of EAD and how EAD connects this to this concept of students' free speech. It's kind of interesting to think about who else are having conversations about EAD and how are we making those connections to the work. Everyone who is on this map, I will say, I'll zoom in for us here. Everyone who's on this map has participated in a workshop around EAD. Okay, and so it really gives us this understanding that this project and this conversation, while today we're talking about it through the lens of student free speech, it really gives us this idea of how it's connecting to all of our content, to all of the work that's happening within our states and our districts around history and civic education. And just a fun fact, one of our farthest participants was in New Zealand, which I think is pretty amazing. So it's just a fun piece to share there. So go ahead and add yourself to the map and let us know, introduce yourself, just so we can know who's in the room. It always makes it for a better discussion when we can have an idea of who's here, who's joining in for us. And again, to add your information, all you're going to do is click on the plus sign and it'll open up a box for you to go ahead and write. Now, I will also add in today, you'll see that throughout the conversation today, we have many opportunities for Padlet to kind of stop, jot your ideas down, do some processing, and really leaving that up to your discretion in terms of the depth that you want to engage. No one could want to share their location. Perfectly fine. Okay. Thinking about really making sure that we're using this space to engage at the depth that you would like to engage. Okay. So keeping that in mind today, and we'll have different stop points in our conversation, really just diving in deeper. So I'm going to go back to our slide deck so that we can start our formal presentation and get right to it. So when we think about EAD, so starting off just with a little context on what is EAD. So when we're thinking about EAD, really this amazing roadmap that was built by a cross-ideological team of experts, historians, political scientists, educators, just coming together to have these conversations in terms of what and how should history and civics be taught? How can we incorporate that? Really, this group was led by Circle, iCivics, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, ASU, and Tufts. And with this work, what was the final product of this work is a guidance on civic and history education excellence. Okay, thinking about what and how to teach history and civics. Now, when we think about the what to teach, you'll see here we have our 7 themes for EAD, starting with civic participation, continuing on to our changing landscape, we the people, a new government and constitution, institution and social transformation, a people in the world, and contemporary debates and possibilities. Now, as we dive deeper into our discussion today, making that connection between freedom of speech and EAD, you'll see us toggle back and forth between our design challenges, between our themes, taking a closer look at some of the themes. And then we're actually going to take some time to think about how we're actually incorporating this into the classroom, taking a closer look at our pedagogy companion. And with our pedagogy companion, what it's doing is it's really capturing the how through those 6 core principles in terms of starting with excellence for all, thinking about the growth mindset and capacity building, building EAD ready classroom and school, inquiry as primary mode of learning, practices of constitutional democracy and student agency, and assess, reflect, and improve. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into those 2 different pieces of EAD. And I will say educating for American democracy, we fondly refer to it as EAD. So if you hear me say EAD, that's what I'm talking about, educating for American democracy. Now, the roadmap itself can be used by teachers, district leaders, states, really thinking about how are we encouraging the telling of America's plural yet shared story, and thinking about how are we having a more complete and honest account of the past, both the good and the bad. How are we striking that balance and cultivating that concept of reflective patriotism? Now, as I showed you those 7 themes, one of the aspects that I really love about the roadmap is with those 7 themes, it's built across K-12. As a former elementary teacher, I personally think that it's essential for us to think about how are we grounding some of these concepts for our youngest learners. So within the roadmap, you'll find there's 4 grade bands, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, that integrate history and civics. And you see how these concepts become more complicated as they progress through K-12. Okay, and the pedagogical strategies are definitely something that as we dive into, you'll see become applicable at different grade levels, really thinking about the students in front of you. Now, as we think about this work, and part of the reason why we share this roadmap and start to build those connections into the content that we're teaching is we have ambitious goals: 60 million students, 100,000 schools, 1 million teachers. This is basically saying we want all of our students, all of our teachers, all of our schools having access to rigorous history and civics instruction. Okay, making sure that they're really having the opportunity to engage deeply in the content and the pedagogical skills. So now, as we think about today's conversation, diving in deeper at Tinker v. Des Moines, and one of the aspects that I really want us to consider as we go through our discussion today, you'll see that I'm bringing in resources from all over. So this short video that we're going to use to start our conversation today is actually from the Bill of Rights Institute. One of the wonderful elements of the EAD initiative is that it's bringing together organizations who have amazing resources to come together and make those connections between them. Okay, so what you'll find is I'll reference Bill of Rights Institute, I'll reference iCivics, I will reference National Constitution Center. So all of these different organizations just constantly sharing the resources that we have, because there's so much out there and so many of these organizations do great work that connect back to the EAD roadmap. So we will start ourselves here, and if you
In
can you hear that
1969,
okay?
the Supreme Court ruled that a public school forbidding students from wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War was a violation of the First Amendment rights.
So how does a seemingly subtle act of protest result in such a momentous decision? And on what basis was the case decided? This is the story of Tinker versus Des Moines.
In 1965, Americans were divided in their support of the Vietnam War, with protests sprouting nationwide.
In Des Moines, Iowa, a group of students led by 15-year-old John Tinker, his sister Mary Beth, and their friend Christopher Eckert quietly carried out their own act of protest by wearing black armbands to school.
The school district prohibited the armbands, threatening suspension or expulsion if the students didn't comply. The Tinker family, active in civil rights and anti-war movements, were committed to protecting free speech and took the school district to court.
After the district court ruled against the Tinkers, the case was brought to the United States Court of Appeals, which resulted in a tie. The Tinker family would make one final appeal in 1968 to the Supreme Court.
With the lower level courts divided, how would our highest court come to a decision, and what would it mean for the Tinker family and other American students?
Attorney Dan Johnston took on the case for Tinker, arguing that the school district's armband policy was unconstitutional and violated the students' First Amendment rights.
He also maintained that since students have been granted constitutional protection of the right to symbolic expression in schools in the 1943 case of West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the same reasoning should apply to the students' use of their armbands.
Opposition to the case was firm, arguing that the students' decision to wear the armbands was a disruption to the school's duty to maintain order. So much so that it outweighed their First Amendment rights.
The interpretation of the Constitution had been debated and a major decision was underway. Do First Amendment rights disappear when a student enters a public school?
According to the Supreme Court, that answer is no. The 7-2 count came with Justice Abe Fortas writing for the majority.
Fortas wrote that teachers and students, quote, do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate.
Fortas further argued that student expression cannot be suppressed when it doesn't interfere with school discipline.
The dissent maintained that the Tinkers' behavior was a disruption, a sentiment echoed in future cases.
In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled that a student could be legally suspended for lewd speech. And in 1988, the court decided that it was within a school's power to censor student newspapers.
Turbulent political times often inspire protests, especially among passionate young people.
What will next test the limits of free speech and result in a Supreme Court controversy? This was the story of Tinker versus Des Moines.
So as we think about the Supreme Court case, Tinker versus Des Moines, I'd love for you to put in the chat, which concepts do you think your students or your educators would grapple onto the most? And what would really resonate with them? So take a moment, and this is just happening in the chat right now, and go ahead and share your thoughts and ideas. I think it's something that one of the benefits of having these short video clips to really give overviews of these key court cases, Supreme Court cases, is that it allows your students to kind of dive in, right? Get that background, get some of that understanding so that you can have deeper conversations over time. So taking a moment, what concepts do you think your students are really going to attach to? Free speech rights don't end at the schoolhouse gate. Student empowerment. Okay, wonderful. And student activism, using their voice to support causes, taking issues to the Supreme Court, the types of speech, symbolic expression, Okay, wonderful. So as we start to see these different topics and these different ways that our students can connect to the work, what I want us to do now is we're actually going to, I'm going to continue us on. Hopefully it won't replay. Of course, it's going to go replay because that's what it's. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. So as we think about free speech and as we think about what the First Amendment protects and what it does not protect, okay, having that conversation with students, thinking about how does it protect speech that doesn't harm others, including offensive words with political messages, the right to not speak, such as refusing to say the Pledge of Allegiance, some forms of financial contributions to political campaigns, commercial advertisements of product and services, symbolic speech, actions that convey meaning, including burning the flag at a political protest. So here where we've seen the First Amendment protects these rights, we can see where the First Amendment does not protect speech that creates a danger. We all know we can't go around yelling fire, making other disturbing scenes or offensive language, spreading or publishing lies that hurt someone's reputation, students advocating illegal drug use at a school-sponsored event, speech that encourages immediate lawless action. Okay, and we can see those tensions that arise here. And I will say, this is one of the resources that comes from iCivics, just the first page of some reading, of some student-facing readings. But we can see where we can start unpacking this concept of free speech with our students, and how do we begin to engage them in these different topics that really grasp their attention. Now, when we think about how we see this connection with EAD, we start with the broadest level in terms of the design challenges, thinking about how can we take these broader points of tensions that we see in history and really have deeper conversations and lean into those tensions. Okay, thinking about design challenge number 1, motivating agency, sustaining the republic. How can we help students understand the full context of their role as civic participants without creating paralysis and a sense of insignificance? Design challenge 2, America's plural yet shared story. How can we integrate the perspectives of Americans from all different backgrounds in narrating our history? E pluribus versus unum. Our design challenge number 3, simultaneously celebrating and critiquing compromise. How do we acknowledge that from its inception, Americans have simultaneously disagreed about the ideal shape of self-government while also ultimately agreeing to preserve shared institutions? Design challenge 4, civic honesty, reflective patriotism. How can we narrate our country's history in a way that is honest about the past without falling into cynicism, and appreciative of its founding without tipping into adulation? And finally, design challenge number 5, balancing the concrete and the abstract. How can we support instructors in helping students move between concrete, narrative, and chronological learning, and thematic, abstract, or conceptual learning? So as we think about these design challenges and these very high level questions to really engage with those points of tension that we see throughout history. Now, one of the wonderful aspects of these design challenges is we can think about how these design challenges really apply to different contexts, different Supreme Court cases. And what I would love for us to do now is thinking about Tinker versus Des Moines and thinking about how can we engage our students in some of these tension with these design challenges here through the lens of that Supreme Court case. So on our Padlet, I'm going to go back over to our Padlet. I'm going to scroll down. Okay, thinking about here on our next Padlet, which EAD design challenge could spark deeper inquiries about Tinker versus Des Moines? How? And what I will do is I'm going to go back and actually put back up the design challenges. We all know that there's nothing worse than having a question like, I couldn't remember the design challenges. So thinking about those design challenges, thinking about which of these design challenges really feel like we could lean into them as we consider the Supreme Court case, Tinker versus Des Moines. Okay, and these designs, as we think about these design challenges, understanding that one of the great aspects of these is it's not something that you're necessarily going to touch on once and never come back to, but that you can constantly revisit through different lenses, through different Supreme Court cases and different issues throughout history. And what I will also say is if it's easier for you to type it in the chat, sometimes that's easier for some of us, that is perfectly fine. If you can tell us which design challenges do you really feel like could connect strongly with Tinker versus Des Moines? Thank you, Scott. Design challenge number 1. I think that's definitely one of the design challenges that I immediately went to, and especially as we think about the attributes that your students would naturally grab onto and grasp from this Supreme Court case. Okay, thinking about their role as civic participants. Okay, are there any other design challenges that we feel could really connect here as well? Design challenge 5, interpretation of the law is abstract, but seeing the concrete example. Okay, excellent. Design challenge 1 and 5. Okay, wonderful. 3. Excellent. And Kathy, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'd love for you to give us a little more thinking behind that.
Yeah, I think it shows, because you're looking at Tinker v. Des Moines and free speech rights, inherent in the free speech rights is this idea that we allow for critiquing of the government, of history, but also that there are limits on that. And sort of, I think whenever we talk about the First Amendment, on behalf of the ABA, there just teachers, there's a tension that is there, and I think it's a really important tension, and I think there's a lot of nuances that you can really challenge students to think about within that. I know Jennifer did a PD with us last week, actually, where we were looking at the right of assembly, and sort of balancing the government's interest within the right of assembly to allow people to have that right and the importance of that right versus maintaining public safety and community security. And within a lot of the First Amendment, there's such a tension in that area between the ability to critique, but also celebrating that ability to critique at the same time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you for letting me put you on the spot. So those of you who are flagging design challenge 1, definitely showing their ability to impact policy, understanding the procedures, understanding how do you actually do this? How do you actually take issues up all the way through the courts to the Supreme Court, and what is the process to do so? Now, one of the other points that, I was going back and forth myself with design challenge number 4, civic honesty and reflective patriotism. One of the reasons that I was leaning into that one is as we think about the challenges that we face within our society, within our communities, understanding that though there might be challenges that we are encountering, there are ways within our system to deepen those conversations and to make those changes. Okay, and so that's definitely one of those other design challenges that's like, I could see where I could take that angle to the conversation as well. Now, as we think about how this connects to the EAD themes, okay, directly correlated with the design challenges, we have many of the themes that we can see those really strong connections to. Okay, if we think about civic participation, thinking about, as many of you brought to the surface here, as we think about civic participation, what does it look like to engage in this process? What does it look like to understand these structures of government, right? Similarly, along with a new government and constitution, and institutional social transformation, and contemporary debates and possibilities. I will say and we'll look at it's civic participation in a little more depth, but one of the aspects that I love tagging on and really appreciate about the design of the EAD roadmap is that theme on contemporary debates and possibilities, where we take this historic case and we think about what are the conversations that are happening today, and where do we see these elements replicated from history and still coming to the surface now. Okay, where do we see, and especially as we think about as our society is changing, growing, more technology is integrated, how does that conversation around free speech begin to fall into our social media? Okay, thinking about our communications, our cell phone use, all of those different aspects, which really then also begins to make the content even more relevant to our students. Okay, and they can begin to see that bridge between the past and the present. So as we think about the EAD roadmap, one of the great characteristics of the roadmap is it really begins to unpack these themes in even more depth. So where the roadmap itself, we know has all the grade levels, within those themes, what they've done is they've posed both thematic questions from a historical lens and from a civics lens. So how have Americans come together in groups, made decisions, and affected their communities, the country, and the world? How can that history inform our civic participation today? And what are the responsibilities and opportunities of citizenship and civic agency in America's constitutional democracy? How can I participate? Okay. And here where we have these big, broad thematic questions, we continue to see that connection to the topic at hand with Tinker versus Des Moines. Okay. And we see these key concepts. So again, every theme is going to have these thematic questions, these key concepts. And as we're thinking about designing learning opportunities for our students, thinking about how we start with these bigger, broader concepts, and we gradually get farther down and focused in the conversation so that our students are able to toggle back and forth between the bigger and broader thematic questions and the more specific driving and support and sample guiding questions. Now, as I mentioned, as we think about the civic participation theme itself and looking closely at the driving questions, really this conversation starts in kindergarten and K2. How have I helped my classroom or family? What does it mean to be part of a group? When or how do we speak up about something? Okay, so again, these are our youngest learners starting to have that conversation. And then we gradually see how it builds upon itself. So when and how do people take action in order to solve problems that affect them and others? What kind of challenges arise when people decide to take action and try to solve problems? Why might we want to make changes at local, state, or national levels? How can we promote change in an effective way? Okay, and here we can see where we can take this, we could take the Tinker versus Des Moines case and we can bring it all the way down to some of our youngest learners in order to start engaging in these conversations and thinking about how we're using these moments in history to really grapple with some of these ideas. And in 6, 8, and 9, 12, we gradually see how it becomes even more complicated. When and where have leaders and change makers emerged in American history? What has motivated them and prepared them for civic engagement? What matters to me and how can I make what matters to me more than myself? I think this is, with that civics question, I think what it does is actually starts to make that, have that reflection and that individual student reflection as well, incorporating, well, what are you passionate about and what matters to you, but how can you think about how that impacts the entire community? Okay. And then in 9-12, how did past generations of Americans understand and answer calls to our civic duty in civil society, religious communities, and politics? What is civil society? Why do some great advocates of constitutional democracy argue that the arena for participation is just as important for a healthy American democracy as our political institutions and laws? Okay. And one of the I will say attributes of the roadmap is, as you noticed in the beginning, I highlighted several themes. And really what that creates the space for us to do is think about, as we discuss this Supreme Court case, what lens do we want to take into the conversation? Okay, do we want to take the lens of a process, okay, and what it means to take an issue through the court system? Do we want to look at it through the lens of participation, thinking about how are students participating in this conversation, okay? And how are students raising issues that matter to them and how are they expressing their thoughts and ideas, okay? And so we can see how these layer on, or how are we making those connections to current events, okay? How are we making those connections to things that are happening in today's world, in today's society, and how are we drawing those connections? So as we think about that, and I've listed a few of the specific questions across some of the themes, how can we utilize the EAD driving and sample guiding questions to deepen student inquiry focused on the freedom of speech? And so here's some more specific questions from some of the themes. So I will just say the codes, when we think about those codes, those little details that help us understand the roadmap even better. So HDQ is history driving question. 1.3C is just saying that this is the 6-8 band, okay, the third band, and a CDQ is a civics driving question. So what I would love to do here is in the chat, go ahead and let us know, how can we utilize the EAD driving and sample guiding questions to deepen student inquiry focused on the freedom of speech? So how can you begin to make those connections? And what I would recommend you to do is think about this through the lens of your work. Think about this through the lens of your classroom, your district, the state, okay, and how you can begin to use some of these questions to deepen your conversations. And you can go ahead and put it right in the chat because that seems to work easier for us today. This is also the great piece of educator wait time, giving people time to write, think, process. And it's important to incorporate that in this conversation, because it's easy to just say, hey, here are some questions, go use them. But rather thinking about, how do we start to see those direct correlations within your classroom? Okay, and thinking about at what level could you have this, could you incorporate these questions? Okay, would some of these questions drive your conversations from a unit lens? Or are you getting all the way down to the lesson plan lens? Okay, and thinking about how you're using these questions to guide your instruction in the classroom. Give everyone just another moment. There we go. Thank you, Kathy. Thinking about that relationship between history and civics and where we see the opportunity to build off of that connection. Wonderful. So as you think of more ways to see that interconnectedness between the history, the civics, and utilizing these driving questions. Okay, jigsawing multiple court cases. I always love a good jigsaw. Then it allows students to really bring those themes to the surface, okay, and responding to these questions so that they begin to see that these are not just single moments in history, but we can see the connectivity across. Help students understand that more important than simply exercising their right to freedom of speech is ensuring that the ideas you are expressing are informed. Excellent. You want to make sure that we are incorporating that we're not just building our statements just out of pulling them from thin air, but we're using information, we're using research. And when we think about how we're designing our lessons in units, is how are we designing the opportunities for our students to actually dive deeper into that skill set and into that research. And I believe, so I do have here, you guys can see on my screen here, I do have here, I believe, incitement from the NEH. So one of their resources, so again, an organization that is part of our EAD champions. And here what we see is the opportunity to dive into not just analyzing the Supreme Court case, but analyzing the research, or learning the research and how to do the research and how to build those arguments and those conversations. So this is definitely a wonderful example to bring back into your students so that they can understand the research that has to go into engaging in these court cases. Okay. Now that we've kind of taken some time to chew on the themes a little bit, the design challenges a little bit, what I want us to do is also take that same time to chew on those pedagogical core principles. Okay. And so as we think about those core pedagogical principles, and rather than just showing the graphic, I kind of annotated some of our thinking, some of my thinking on here, as well as we think specifically about the Supreme Court cases. But when we think about core principle number 1, excellence for all, really what that's establishing is the foundation that we are holding high expectations that all of our students can engage in this rich and rigorous history and civics content. As we then progress in core principle 2, growth mindset and capacity building, thinking about what is the learning that we have to engage with in order to either deepen our content knowledge, deepen our instructional pedagogical strategies, and then finally continue on to core principle number 3 in terms of building an EAD ready classroom and school. And this core principle number 3 really reinforces that establishing an EAD ready classroom is one thing, and then thinking about how does the classroom environment connect to the school as a whole. Our classroom teachers do amazing things, and how do we create that experience for others in the building as well? We can't put all the onus on individual teachers, but think about the community and the atmosphere the environment that has to be created within the school to engage in these rigorous conversations. When we think about core principles 1, 2, and 3, really what they're reinforcing is the learning dispositions and the environment that has to be established in order to engage in those rigorous conversations. So thinking about how do we build a classroom environment to deeply engage in a conversation about freedom of speech? Okay? What are the practices that we would have to incorporate into our classroom? And I'll dive into that in just a moment, into some of the examples provided by the roadmap itself. Now, with core principle number 4, inquiry as a primary mode of learning, this is when we're thinking about what is the instructional arc and the inquiry arc that we're designing for our students to engage with in order to allow them to be the individuals grappling with the information, grappling with the content, making sure they're becoming informed as we think about that earlier comment, and thinking about how are we designing inquiries to allow our students to engage deeply with the content. Oftentimes we see situations, and sometimes you have to do a direct instruction, stand and deliver for a little bit to get some content. But we know that students learn even more as they're doing the thinking themselves, as they're analyzing the documents, as if it's a jigsaw activity and they're unpacking these Supreme Court cases. And then continuing on to core principle number 5, practices of constitutional democracy, and thinking how are you giving your students the opportunity to practice the skills associated with Supreme Court cases. So it could be the research, it could be the deliberation, it could be all of these different aspects. It could be even just raising the issue itself. All of these different skills that we want to make sure that our students are understanding and thinking about, not leaving the knowledge about the case sitting by itself, but thinking about how are we then reinforcing the skills that our students would need as well. And then finally, closing the cycle with assess, reflect, and improve. With this core principle number 6, really creating the space for us to incorporate formative assessments into our learning, thinking about where are we providing opportunities for student reflection and feedback in order to continue to improve our instruction in the classroom. Now, as I'm going back to that concept of building an EAD ready classroom and school, thinking about fostering that supportive school environment, strengthening family and community connections, developing student social emotional competencies and character, developing student voice and leadership. Now, with building that EAD ready classroom and developing and building those, incorporating those strategies into our conversation, think about what could this look like from the student lens and the teacher lens. So in the Pedagogy Companion, what you will find, and I'll show you where to download this all later, but what you'll find is you'll actually find some recommended teacher moves and student moves. Now, we know that this list could be exhaustive, but just giving some foundational pieces of what could teachers be doing in the classroom, and at the same time, what could students be doing in the classroom? So if we have our students creating opportunities or have our educators creating opportunities through a variety of discussion structures and protocols for students to understand diverse perspectives, helping students engage productively with disagreements and solving conflict, thinking about what does that look like from the student side? How are we developing and exercising student voice and choice in the classroom? Are we letting them select which case studies, which Supreme Court cases they're diving more deeply into? Thinking about how are we creating the space for them to engage collaboratively with peers and learning those different roles and responsibilities. So thinking about the pedagogy really giving us those strategies for the classroom. As we then think about a little deeper about the primary inquiry as the primary mode of learning, thinking about how are we creating these authentic real world opportunities to build our student knowledge through analysis and investigation. And here we're designing lessons that kind of uncover the complexity of events, social groups, individuals, okay, thinking about how we're giving those opportunities to analyze different forms of evidence. So think about if we're doing jigsaws, how are we doing jigsaws that might be an overview of the case, but also primary accounts. thinking about images, thinking about the newspaper, thinking about how are we providing different opportunities for our students to really engage and gather that information and build their historical thinking skills and their media literacy skills. And thinking about how are we allowing our students to evaluate strengths and weaknesses of sources, applying historical thinking skills, constructing written and oral arguments, using evidence, again, making informed arguments. And finally, when we think about those practices of constitutional democracy and student agency, how are we creating those experiences and opportunities? Okay. Now, these experiences and opportunities, it could be in the form of a simulation. It could be in the form of a debate. You see lots of the opportunity to draw connections from the past to present day. And going to show a few more resources here that can help spark some of that. So with some of our own iCivics resources. There we go. Sorry about that. Let me scroll up. Okay, this was the same piece that we showed in the very beginning, thinking about where we see these issues continue to happen throughout different court cases. Okay, providing our students the opportunity to engage a little bit deeper with that. In another resource, again, this one's iCivics, but in another resource, providing the opportunity to actually think about what is the Tinker test. Okay, think about how would you apply that to different scenarios today, okay, that they're encountering. So we see that as well here with some of these resources. Let's see what else I have here. There's another, and what I will do, I will say what I will be doing is I will share these links with Kathy, and she'll be sending them out with you to you so that you have access just to a few more resources coming from a variety of organizations that can just give you some more insight of how to deepen the student conversation. Now, with this resource here, this is another short video clip, again, 2 minutes. It's great, enough to spark conversations, spark student engagement, then deepen the thinking after and the analysis afterwards. And our last two pieces, virtual field trips from the First Amendment Museum that's actually located in Maine. So the First Amendment Museum is another one of our EAD champions. So they have some amazing virtual field trips to, again, have some of those opportunities to have some of those mock conversations and mock cases, Supreme Court cases. Now, all of these resources, I will say all of these resources come from our EAD champions. Some of them you can find online at our educator resources. You can find all of the questions from the interactive roadmap on the website. So one of the great aspects of the EAD website, and I will put this in the chat too, if you do not already have it. There we go. So one of the wonderful aspects of the EAD website is it really allows you to unpack the various questions, and both driving and sample guiding questions connected to the themes and the grade levels, but doing so in a more interactive way. Okay, not just download. So you can download the report and the roadmap itself, but the interactive roadmap really allows you to toggle a little bit faster across the grade levels and see those connections. And additionally, some of these resources you'll find on our educator resources. I will say our EAD resources, this library currently has about 200 resources and growing. I think our goal by the end of the year is to reach somewhere around 1,000 resources on here. And with resources that are on our educator resource site go through a very rigorous process of review. So they're reviewed by 2 educators, by an advisory board. And so that's why some of our resources are there. Some of them aren't there yet, but that doesn't mean that they won't be there. Okay, so and this is just some of our champions you can see here, some of the champions that have been engaging in this work and continue to engage in this work, which is also very exciting to think about. And so as we close out today, thinking about how can some of these different components of the EAD roadmap inform your planning and instruction around the concept of the freedom of speech, and how can it, so taking that time, just a few minutes, putting your thoughts and ideas into the chat. And if you would like, I know we are all off camera here, but if you would like to unmute yourself and talk, please feel free to do so. And just thinking about how can we start to see the connectivity between all of this?
Natasha, I'll unmute myself and say one thing that I'm taking away from this session today is the idea of building on what Tanya had suggested about doing the jigsaw to answer some of these questions using multiple cases, and then integrating the idea of the students choosing the cases that they want to look at to answer those questions. I love doing jigsaws and doing them sort of doing the historic approach, but through a thematic eye. So we tend to do them a lot on like the Fourth Amendment and how Fourth Amendment had different standards have changed over time, and technology has impacted or not impacted how the court looks at the Fourth Amendment. And so what I think would be really interesting is to use those questions, particularly for the freedom of speech issue, and ask students to find a case that somehow answers or informs their learning to look at that question, and then having them do a jigsaw on that, I think would just be a really, really interesting way. I mean, you can give them a set of cases to pick from, but I think that would be a really interesting way to have them look both at sort of the historic lens of it, but also the civics lens of it at the same time.
Exactly, Kathy. And I also think about how we do something similar with issues that are happening today, right? Issues that we see going through the courts today, and doing that same comparison. Where do we see these points of connection? Where do we see these points of difference? But specifically around that concept of freedom of speech. So definitely, and that connects wonderfully with theme 7 in terms of contemporary debates, thinking about all of those different aspects. It really allows us to have those deeper conversations. So thank you, Kathy. So any other ideas, or anyone else who would like to unmute themselves and share, or go ahead and type in the chat? Any other ways that they can think about using the different components? Yes, changing technologies and the impact of that. Wonderful. Thank you, Scott.
I plan to start the school year, which is next week, with my seniors with BL. I had them as juniors last year, and of course we ended school before the courts decided. And go with the case first, and they reference in the case in BL Tinker several times, and hopefully the inquiry method of, well, what is Tinker, and work our way back to history, then to pull it back forward through and how Tinker applied to this case.
That's a great way to do it. And I love that thinking in terms of how starting with the present, going backwards, and kind of going back and forth those periods of time, really give our students that flexibility to understand how it's all related.
And Natasha, I just put in the chat a link to a video we did for the first session of this speaker series on BL with Adam Liptek from the New York Times. And so he really talked about the case, and even looping into Scott's idea about how some of like the technology is really changing and pushing some of this First Amendment discourse. So that would be a great way to pull out a clip or two for your students.
Thank you, Kathy. Any other thoughts, ideas, connections? Give us another moment. And while anyone else is just sharing, doing some thinking and pondering, just wanted to share, follow our Twitter handle at EAD Roadmap. Share your ideas with hashtag EAD Roadmap. Just continue the conversation, thinking about how we continue to share our thinking. How can we then continue to engage with others who are thinking about this and the relationship with the EAD initiative as well. And on that note, I will say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And then I'm going to turn it back to Kathy. I really appreciated your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you, Natasha. On behalf of the American Bar Association, the Sacramento Federal Judicial Library Learning Center Foundation, and this program is with the support of the James B. McClatchy Foundation as well. We just so appreciate you and the iCivics team and the EAD team taking a minute to spend some time with us. To our teachers, we'll be following up with all of the resources. This video recording will be available on the ABA website, as well as linked on the Judicial Learning Foundation's Learning Centers Foundation website as well. And I would encourage you to reach out to me or Natasha if you have additional questions or need some follow-up support. So with that, I know everyone is very busy getting ready for the school year to start. So thank you all, and we will be in touch.
Thank you, everybody.